mysterious. Welcome back, fam. Today's encounters, and I do have two of them for you, are very intense, to say the least. I'm going to warn you right off the rip here. The first one is really sad. It involves a kid going missing. It's, like I said, pretty intense. I hope you stick around, but if you are easily emotional due to stories that involve kids going missing, and this is a Bigfoot channel, so you kind of know where we're going here. I'm just going to give you a little bit of a forewarning. It's one of those. So in the second story we have is definitely intense, but not in the same way. That said, let's get into today's Bigfoot Encounters. If you haven't already, I'd appreciate you hitting that subscribe button. Let's jump into our first story. Some 25 years ago, my wife and I lived in a neighborhood setting in suburbia. Heavy traffic, malls, school buses, and the whole urban lifestyle. We had some neighbors who had a large and expensive mobile home, which they always put to good use. They had two children, being a young girl of 8 years old and a small son who was 4 at the time. They were going on a 3-week trip out west and asked us to keep an eye on their house and empty the mailbox, which we did. When they had arrived back home, I saw them pull up. And not wanting to jump all over them after such a trip, I waited for several hours. Finally, I walked over to their door and I was all smiles as I knocked, earnestly waiting to hear about their trip. When the door opened, John looked 20 years older and solemnly asked me to come in. I felt like I just walked into a wake. And I did. I saw Mary in the kitchen, and as she turned to say hello, she began to cry, saying, "Little Bobby is gone." I stood there in silence as they began to tell me what happened. 2 days after our arrival, we had our camper parked in a beautiful little spot 100 feet from the lake and next to a green field of high grass. Lisa and I were in the camper, and John and Bobby were outside playing catch with a ball. John had literally jumped into the camper for 15 seconds to grab his cigarettes, and when he went back out, shouting, began, "Bobby, Bobby, Bobby, where are you?" Lisa and I came jumping out, saying, "What's going on?" "Bobby's gone, he's gone. We've got to find him." We were running everywhere, shouting his name, and heard and saw nothing. John told me to run and check the station to get help quickly. By the time I came back, there were people everywhere, looking in and by the lake, out in the field, in the woods, everywhere else. All of them were screaming his name and nothing. As the day wore on, police arrived and dogs and a helicopter flying all over the area. A search party was formed and bands of volunteers began marching around the woods and surrounding area looking for our little boy wearing blue clothes. He was so small, and it wasn't like him to just run away like that, especially so quickly and not answering us. Even if it had been a game, he would have jumped out and said boo or something. For a solid week, the search continued, encompassing miles and miles around the camp, and nothing. The only thing that they had encountered was a hiker who said he saw what looked like a man wearing black coveralls carrying a blue sack on his shoulders along a ridge. When I heard the word blue, my heart sank. We stayed for the entire time, taking part in the searches, and in the end, had committed him to the hands of God. Bobby was gone without a trace, and I could not believe what I was hearing, and only minutes later my wife had arrived, and we all relived it again. It was years later when it dawned on me that this apparent man in black with the blue sack was, and that was my reason for contacting you with this story. Wow. Well, I know that one was short and not so sweet, but the hiker, having seen that large man in coveralls, or however he described him, carrying a quote-unquote blue sack over his shoulder. What do y'all think? I don't like those stories so much, but they are evidence of a creature that our government just refuses to recognize. Well, let's jump into our second story of the day. This one was a crazy sighting, actually. This one comes to us from Harold. He's a resident of British Columbia. He now lives in Wisconsin. It was the time of year for our annual caribou hunt in 1989, when my hunting partner and I ventured into an area below the Kiwatinik Ridge alongside the Kiwatinik River in British Columbia, where we were working the area between the river and Mounts Marpole and Carnarvon. Not sure if I pronounced that right. With Hamilton Ridge to our south. It was a crisp morning, and we were seeing some animals starting to move, with none of them being to our liking, and the distance between us and the herd was too great as well. Having seen this activity, we decided to follow in the direction of the herd in hopes of seeing a more substantial animal at some point. We'd made our way all the way down where the warden's cabin was located on the southwest side of Hamilton Ridge, and we were now at the point where we were sandwiched between Hamilton and Tocher Ridges, respectively. At this point, my partner and I were sitting with our bodies facing the opposing directions. I was combing Hamilton Ridge with my binoculars, and Dennis was combing Kiwatinik with his. We had to have been sitting there for over an hour, observing the movements of a number of caribou, when Dennis said to me, "I've never seen a timber wolf that big in my entire life. And check this thing out, Harold." On his cue, I turned and began to fix my binoculars on the area in which he was now pointing. At this point, the two of us were now sitting, eyes fixed on what appeared to be a wolf that was the size of a bull elk. A fact which was, in and of itself, hard to digest mentally. The distance was great, but based on the size of the larger caribou it was stalking, walking well below them, it was twice the size of the largest male, which didn't make any sense. To me, what I was seeing was an impossibility in the natural world. A timber wolf at this size would have to be in the neighborhood of 1,500 to 2,000 pounds, maybe more, which just cannot be. I was looking right at it. I saw what I saw. I said to Dennis that it must be a bear or something. But it's got the head of a wolf. But even as I said it, I didn't even believe my own words. I couldn't even make sense of what I was seeing. And the coloration wasn't right for a bear, and yet the rump sat too high with the spine being the profile of a wolf. It was truly a puzzlement to the both of us. We sat watching this beast. It was obviously stalking the herd from a lower position on the ridge. It must have been about 20 minutes later, as we both sat watching intently, that this beast lifted off the ground with what we believed to be its front legs, which were now hanging from the body, and began to make its way up the hill towards the herd, appearing just as a hunter would be holding his rifle or something, trying to get closer without being seen. This thing was now walking on its hind legs, hunched over like a man. It made its way into position behind a bush, where it once again squatted down and was evidently watching the activity above it, as we were. The herd was lumbering along and had to have consisted of over 50 animals or more, when suddenly, as we watched, this beast made a lightning-fast movement, closing the gap between itself and the herd, repositioning itself behind another grouping of bushes just below them. A couple of the caribou seemed to be momentarily startled as they began to trot, but then all things settled down again. Just moments later, this creature launched itself into an uphill and diagonal run, aiming towards the middle of the herd, and the animals began to run. But the creature, being much faster to our eyes, closed the gap so quickly and launched its body, swatting a female to the ground, with what appeared to be one blow from its now extended arm, very much like a grizzly would whack down an animal from the back in a chase. It was now on top of the caribou, thrashing at its body in a violent manner with both of its now apparent arms. This creature, while straddling the caribou's body, had thrown so many blows in such a brief amount of time, it was inconceivable to our eyes how many had actually been thrown. This was followed by a long pause where it just sat on top of its victim, apparently resting and eyeing its prize. Some 15 minutes later or so, this wolf-man-like beast stood to its feet and hoisted the caribou, placing over its shoulders like a woman wearing a mink stole, and began to walk back down the slope, angling to our north. It was then I said to Dennis, "I have to see its face." And leveling my sight on the hill in front of it, I pulled the trigger, firing a single shot, the sound of which bounced back and forth between the ridges, and it was loud. As soon as the blast occurred, the wolf man stopped in its tracks and looked directly at us. Immediately, Dennis said to me, "Look at that sucker's head. He has a long snout and pointy ears. It's a damn half-human, half-wolf." He was right, I guess. A 2,000-pound half-human, half-wolf. Its body was long and lanky, covered in what was gray hair or fur. From our perspective, it had a long but tapered snout, kind of like a gray wolf, with what seemed to be a variety of coloration to its face. Its ears were protruding upward from the head like two small triangles, and there was no doubt about it. It just stood there, apparently unafraid of who we were or what we could potentially do to it for almost 2 minutes. The creature then began to trot away with some very long strides across the face of the ridge at a speed which quite simply a man could not achieve. And all of this while shouldering what must have been at least a 200 or 300 pound animal on its back. In what was a matter of only a few minutes, this wolfman thing had covered about a half a mile and disappeared into the timber at the base to our north. Dennis and I sat back to compare notes about what we had seen. When we had seen it on the caribou straddling it, the back was lean and V-shaped, appearing to be very muscular. When the arms began to thrash at the fallen caribou, they were extremely long, and the movements were performed at a speed which seemed like a blur. After having risen to its feet, it hoisted the body around its neck and shoulders like you or I would a 5-pound bag of potatoes, as if it was nothing. I think the craziest damn moment of all was when we saw it lift up from being on all fours to 2 legs, which was the defining moment of the sighting. This singular movement completely blew us out of the water. We both at that point knew we were seeing something totally unique and quite frankly extraordinary, if not supernatural. And yet, there it was, hunting and walking, attacking a flesh and blood animal for food. It was otherworldly and beyond incredible. Well, holy smokes, what do y'all think of that one? I mean, I've heard Dogman stories, Wolfman stories, stuff like that, but this thing was hunting caribou, and it got one, and it was shouldering that animal like a bag of potatoes. I don't know, man. I will say it's hard to believe, but it's almost hard to not believe after hearing so many stories. I'll tell you what, you never know what you're going to see out there. Well, if y'all love this video, I appreciate y'all subscribing if you haven't already. Smack that like button. And let me know down in the comments where you're watching from. And if you've had any kind of an encounter with a Bigfoot, Wolfman, Dogman, Mothman, aliens, ghosts, I love hearing them all. Please drop me an email at cryptidmysterious@gmail.com, and I'll see y'all in the next one.